Don't.
I got to talk. I got to tell what I feel. I got to talk about my life as I see it.
All right, then. It's time for you to bring it to the table.
Turn up your radio wherever you at. We about to bring it.
Street Beat.
Yeah.
With Tony B.
For the next hour, Tony B will give you a chance to tackle local, national, and international issues that affect your community.
Street Beat.
Street Beat. Win.
Tony B.
Good morning, good afternoon, wherever we're at in this process. Have a good one. It's me, Tony B. You are listening to Street Beat right here on Rainier Avenue Radio. I have a very interesting show for you today. Well, everyone knows that we just spent an entire week on Earth Deserves More Than a Day, talking about environmental justice. Just a number of different panels, lectures, workshops, films, an incredible week of information sharing environmental justice and what that means and what it is. And yeah, it's a lot more than the polar ice caps melting in Greenland. I know that's part of it. Then there are some things that affect our urban communities right here. Air quality, water quality, transportation justice. There are so many issues that fall under the banner of environmental justice. And we decided we'd take a closer look at the impact of our water quality. Joining me on the program is Sean Wilson. Sean actually works for the Department of Ecology, and somehow that works out with King County. Sean, how are you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Well, let's figure this out first. You work for the Department of Ecology.
Yeah. So
Okay.
the Department of Ecology is kind of, if folks are familiar with, like, on a federal level, what the EPA is. So the Department of Ecology is the state version
And
of
the
that.
EPA, I know there's a lot of acronyms that we throw around, but I'm just going to kind of get us out of that mode. EPA is
The Environmental Protection Agency.
all right.
So yeah, no, sorry. I'll do my best to kind of swim out of the acronym soup and give you all some use the full name. But
And then let's talk about that too. The Environmental Protection Agency is a federal organization.
yes,
That
that is in charge of kind of protecting the environment. So it was created, I believe, in the 1960s, 70s or something in that range. And they're the federal institution, and Department of Ecology is the statewide folks in charge of protecting our environment here within the state. And actually, we predate the EPA, so it's kind of cool.
wow. Okay. So does every state, I don't know if you know that, have a Department of Ecology?
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, almost all states or all states have their own state version of kind of environmental protection, and different states manage it in different ways. So sometimes the federal government is more involved with the states and the way that they protect the environment, and some states like Washington, there's the states have a more established programs, and so the federal government has more of an oversight role rather than a doing role. But just kind of depends state to state.
Okay. Well, I would imagine that our Department of Ecology, because we have such a big backyard, you know.
Yeah, there's quite a few folks that work within the Department of Ecology, and there's a lot of different departments, like you mentioned, or kind of units within the Department of Ecology. So, that includes folks like me who work in water quality, but there's also air quality folks who are interested in or looking at protecting our shorelines, folks that are looking at water resources and drinking water, all sorts of different, the hazardous waste, toxic cleanups, all sorts of different units.
Okay, so this is what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about essentially the water quality in South Seattle. Now, obviously that flows a number of different places, but we're going to be interested in hearing about the water quality in South Seattle. And you can connect the dots for us as that flows into other communities. There's this thing called the Henderson MLK. Is it a wastewater treatment center? Do I have that right? Is that what it is?
Yeah, that's one name for it. That's a good way to call it. I think a good place to start is that in a lot of communities, there's kind of two main forms of wastewater or water. So one of those is maybe what you think of when you think of wastewater, which is when you flush your toilet and that stuff goes away. That's kind of traditional wastewater.
It leaves and it goes somewhere. I don't exactly know, but yes, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so that's one form of wastewater. There's other forms of water that we collect, we as a society collect, one of which is stormwater. So when rain falls on your roof or rain falls on the street, or water gets on the street from a fire hydrant leaking or whatever, that also has to go somewhere, right? We have storm drains in the street. Maybe you've seen some. And in Seattle, we have an older system, right? So older than maybe a newer city that popped up. And those two systems in Seattle are combined. So we have what's called a combined sewer system through, a good chunk of the city. And what that means is that wastewater system manages both the stormwater, so both water that rains and kind of gets on the streets, as well as the stuff that flushes down your toilet. And the Henderson MLK area is one of those, part of that broader combined sewer system.
So let me ask a question here.
Yeah.
Is this a maze of pipes underground? That's what we're talking about, right?
For sure, right? There's all sorts of different sizes going from, your house or your apartment or wherever you live, or the streets, and then they kind of connect, and in some places those meld, and in some places they don't, and they all eventually work their way. And the main treatment facility for the entire Seattle area, for the most part, is located kind of in west Seattle, in the Discovery Park. It's called, or near Discovery Park. It's the West Point wastewater treatment plant. So that's on a dry weather day when there's no rain, when there's kind of low flows through all those pipes, the stuff, the wastewater, the toilet water from South Seattle, the stormwater from South Seattle goes to West Point. When it starts to get, the flows start to get much higher, right? So that's typically with rain. That's when this Henderson MLK facility kind of kicks in and becomes valuable as part of that system.
You are listening to Street Beat. It's me, Tony B. We're having a discussion ultimately about environmental justice here, but I'm finding this fascinating to find out that there is this system in place where water from the toilets that everyone flushes and stormwater drains, and it all goes somewhere, and we never really think about it. We just know that it happens. So what I'm going to ultimately want to get to it is to find out how secure, how safe that is, how does it impact our drinking water, and then this treatment facility, what does it treat? And then when it's treated, where does it go? So we'll go back again, and thank you for that wonderful explanation. This Henderson MLK, you describe it as an overflow system, right? How does that work?
Right. So the main facility, West Point, is designed to treat kind of the base load. So the kind of standard flows. When the rains start to increase, or and the flows through the system get really large, that system can get overwhelmed. And so in order to prevent that system from getting overwhelmed, there's upstream treatment facilities and storage facilities. So what those do is kind of act like a buffer, right? They buy West Point some time, ideally, to kind of chew through that flow at a consistent rate, rather than trying to deal with these big peaks when we get a heavy storm event or rain event coming through. So most of the Henderson MLK CSO treatment plant, for the most part, when I use CSO, I should explain that. Sorry, it's combined sewer overflow or combined sewer system. And that facility predominantly acts like a storage, like a big tank. And its job is just to kind of reduce those surges. If you think about noise or volume, right? Those big peaks that come through, it's kind of leveling that all out and making the flow a little more consistent to West Point.
Wow. Now, maybe you can explain to me how this works, because the city is not level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And as far as I know, water flows down. Mm-hmm. But we've got this system underground. How does that work?
You're absolutely right. Right. Gravity is the main thing that is used to convey these wastewater. You're not wrong there. You're absolutely right. But there are times we've got to get it over a hill, or we got to get it over someplace. And so there are plenty of pump stations operated both by the city and also by the county that move these flows kind of over those hills. So, when we think about flows coming down kind of over the Rainier Ridge and then down into the Duwamish Valley, well, they got to get to West Point somehow, right up to North Seattle somehow, and they're not going to flow there by gravity all the time. And so they do have pump stations to kind of keep that stuff moving. But they also site those facilities in a way that hopefully is at a lower elevation and can kind of reduce the amount of pumping that they have to do, because it's better for them to just use gravity, right? Like let the gravity do the work for you to the extent you can. You can't always do it. Sometimes you do need that pump, but yeah, that's the short answer.
So what role does the Henderson MLK CSO, which CSO means again
combined sewer
overflow.
Mm-hmm.
What role does that play in treatment, or does it play a role in treatment, or does this water just go there and sit there until it needs to go somewhere else? Is there anything that happens at the MLK Henderson that could be potentially, aside from this being wastewater, but are there any chemicals involved in this process at the MLK Henderson?
Certainly the main one that is at Henderson MLK, which they use when they're discharging, is chlorine. So that's the adding the chemical that they add. And the reason for that is, if we think about wastewater, the things that there's many things that can be of concern in terms of chemicals. The two simplest things to think about in terms of wastewater sometimes is sediments, right? Like things floating in the water, chunks. We don't want that. And we also don't want bacteria or viruses or, those type of things going out with the water. So the two main things that that CSO treatment plants, including Henderson MLK, are focused on removing is floating in solids and sediments within the water that they treat, and as well as trying to reduce that bacteria or kind of loading that might go out with their effluent. So they add chlorine, right, to treat that.
Okay, so this is a question I don't know the answer to, and I'm going to just lay it out there. What should folks in this community around the MLK Henderson overflow be concerned about?
Yeah. So as far as hazardous waste, all that stuff, just let us know and obviously it's supposed to work a certain way to be protective in it. But what are the things that we should be concerned about? Yeah. So most of the time, I guess the good news is that most of the time that outfall is not discharging, right? So most of the time, wastewater is still being conveyed all the way to West Point for treatment there. What's probably most important for folks to understand is when there is water coming out of, or effluent wastewater coming out of that outfall. And the best way to figure out if that's occurring is King County operates a website. And if you Google like King County CSO outfalls or King County sewage overflow or anything like that, and one of the first links that kind of pops up is this map. And it shows locations of all the places across the city where they have overflows that can occur, or pipes that can discharge wastewater, including the Henderson MLK one. And each one is a little dot. And if the dot is green, that means nothing has flowed out of there within the last 48 hours, I believe is what their threshold is. If it's a yellow dot, it means it's not currently discharging, but it did discharge within the last 48 hours. And then it'll turn red if it's actively discharging. And if the dot is kind of red, they have some guidance there about how folks should interact with kind of the wastewater or the waters around that area in that case, which is typically avoidance of that area. So that's probably the most important thing to know is like, is it discharging or is it not discharging? From an ecology perspective, we write, our job is to ensure that the way that the facilities are operated and kind of working with the county to do so, to make sure that those facilities operate in a way that is protective of water quality to the extent possible. And there's two big components of these systems, which are, in my mind, right? You have the things that they're doing currently and the kind of long-term plans. So in the case of Henderson MOK, right, their goal is to kind of refine or the requirements within the new permit ask them to do a little bit more to try and kind of improve some specific chemicals in the effluent, particularly copper. But the main goal there is to operate that facility in a way that removes the sediment and removes those bacteria. So to circle back to kind of what your initial question was about, what is the things that folks need to be worried about? Predominantly, it's being aware of when that is discharging, because that really affects the behavior that folks in the community might have around that outfall, right? Should they be playing in the water next to it? So.
Okay, so a couple questions here that people might be having. Is this any way connected to the water that comes into our home that we consider water that we're going to use to drink, to wash dishes, to, for whatever reason this water is coming into our home? Is there any potential for this overflow to get into that system of water that's coming into our homes?
Yeah. I'll start by saying I'm not a drinking water expert, but from my understanding, the most of the water sources that the city of Seattle has and is up kind of in the mountains, right? And it kind of flows down. And all of those, talk about the maze of pipes that are underneath the city.
Yeah.
There's no mixing of the drinking water pipes with any other pipes, right? They have a separate system that regulates them, separate permits, separate pipes, separate everything for them. And everything in the environment is a cycle, right? There's certainly things that go out into the environment some of them can disappear and some of them don't, right? They all kind of circle back, but the further you can separate yourself from that cycle, the better, right? And so the overflows that go out at Henderson or at other places in the King County system and the Seattle system are not so close, right? Because it has to go out to the Puget Sound, and then it's got to pick it up as rainwater. It's got to land in the mountains as snow, and then it melts, and that goes to the reservoirs. So there's that kind of disconnection. There's not as far as I'm aware, the city of Seattle and King County are not, picking up their drinking water from somewhere in Puget Sound or in the Duwamish River.
All right, I just wanted to get that clear because we're not going to be talking about our drinking water because they're separate things. So although there are maybe concerns about filtration and when that water comes from the mountains, what's put into the water, and then how that's removed from the water. That's not what we're talking about today. We're going to be talking about wastewater. So this wastewater eventually has to go somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And just kind of break that down. What happens to this waste after the entire process? And we're going to go back and cover some other stuff. But after the process of treating the water, removing certain things, where does this water go?
Yeah. So on a normal day, on an average day, probably today, I don't see too much rain in the forecast. It should all go to West Point, where they do a variety of treatments. And then they have a huge outfall, physically large, a couple feet, I think, in diameter. And it sticks out kind of off the point there of Discovery Park, or that kind of point, a couple 100 feet, I believe, out. And that's where that water goes. So it goes back into the kind of Puget Sound
Okay.
Where it goes.
Goes back into the sound.
Exactly.
Where we fish and swim.
Absolutely.
So I guess this is what people would be concerned about.
Yeah, and the way that ecology and the state kind of looks at this is, so we have things called water quality standards.
Okay.
And there's a variety of different water quality standards. Some are based upon aquatic life, and there's some of those are for marine environments, saltwater, like the Puget Sound, and some of them are for freshwater, because those fish and those organisms need different protections for each of those. So the main way that we assess that is through those water quality standards. Is we look at those, we look at human health criteria and how humans and the types of activities that humans use that water for. And based upon all of those different factors and a bunch of science, ecology comes up with those standards. It says, okay, the water that comes out of whatever pipe needs to meet this standard, and if it meets that standard, it should not damage or hurt the fish. It should not damage or hurt other aquatic or other things living in the aquatic area, and shouldn't harm humans. So, and then we write our
but it's not suggested as drinking water.
Correct. Yeah. So yeah, that is different. So we have water quality standards, right? Like what we would call water quality standards, which means ambient water, like the river or the ocean or whatever. That's I use the word water quality to mean that. And then there's a separate set of guidelines for drinking water standards, which has an entirely different set of math and criteria and science behind how they establish those standards. And frequently, as far as I'm aware, those are quite different numbers, right? And there's a reason for that, which is right. The basis of the science is different. Direct human uptake versus it's going to mix with things, or it's going to be, in other places. So.
You're listening to Street Beat. It's me, Tony B. My guest is Sean Wilson from the Department of Ecology. We're talking wastewater. We're talking
fun stuff.
Water quality. And again, one of the things that we want to know is if there is the potential for anything to happen in the South Seattle area based off of the fact that we have this MLK, Henderson, CSO, and I call it a wastewater, but CSO stands for
Combined Sewer Overflow.
Combined Sewer Overflow. Is there the potential that there should be anything that we should be worried about in our community during a heavy rain, or the potential of overflow? And there's things that we see happen on the street. Sometimes we see those sewer grates and they're full, and it's after a heavy rain or flooding, or the snow,
snow melt.
Snow melt. Yeah, that's what I was getting at. And we've already talked about the fact that this does not impact and affect the drinking water. Completely different system, correct?
Right. Those are different systems. Yeah, wastewater and drinking water. Completely
different systems. However, what can you let us know that if this does happen, when water is discharged, what are the possibilities of this overflow being contaminated in some way? Do we have enough holding facilities? I guess that's what. How do we safeguard this discharge from going out of this point? The
outfall or wherever. Yeah. I think the way, and maybe folks are familiar with the kind of old at this point, maybe thing when it comes to kind of waste and recycling. Of people hear, reduce, reuse, recycle.
Yeah.
And when it comes to maybe these systems, the way I think about it, instead of reduce, reuse, recycle, right, it's kind of reduce, store, and treat.
Okay.
So the best thing we can all do, right, is reduce the volume of water that's going into these systems and the contaminants that go in there, right? Whether that's the wear of tires on the streets, when brake pads wearing down and that dust that builds up on the sides of streets with street cleaning, or fertilizers that folks use in their, might use in their yard, or that folks might use at businesses. or whatever, right? Reducing the sources of these kind of pollutions to the system or volume to the system. If we can't reduce the sources, then the next thing that we try and do to reduce the impact is store it, right? Keep it in the system, send it to those larger treatment facilities like West Point that have a more robust treatment capability. And if we can't do those two things, then the next best option is treatment at, small scale treatment at facilities like Henderson MLK, which don't provide all of the treatment that West Point does, but do provide some treatment. And the reason that those facilities don't provide all of the treatment that West Point does is because they only operate a few times a year, right? They're kind of the last line of defense in some ways, right? If they're after the reduction, after storage, then their treatment, they're only intended to operate a few times a year. And that's what we see with Henderson MLK, where it discharges roughly once a year. So not very frequently, because it is kind of that third option.
And when it discharges, where does it discharge?
It discharges at the Norfolk outfall, which is kind of it's sort of in the middle portion of the Duwamish, middle being south of the First Avenue Bridge, but before the river turns into a natural stream. So while it's still channeled, kind of near the airport down there.
You know what, Sean? This is really, we're almost out of time.
Oh wow!
You've done a great job of explaining this, but I do want to. So, are there things? What other things that folks should not pour down the sewer? I mean, there's probably a bunch, but what are some things you say? Hey, make a conscious effort. If you have this particular thing, I don't know what it may be. I'm gonna look. And then where you should take those things to be safe, so that we make sure that we don't, as people who live in the community, create the issue, making it worse than it already is.
Yeah. So I think that the general rule is just because you can buy it doesn't mean it's safe to go down a drain. And so there's a lot of things that can be there. I think the most common ones that the wastewater treatment plants always talk about is those flushable wipes that folks use for maybe children and stuff. They're not really actually flushable. They clog up a lot of the system. They might go into the pipe and go away from your house, but they can cause problems there. And from a chemical perspective, it's predominantly household cleaners or fertilizers that folks are using outside, or motor oils or things that folks use greases when they're doing car maintenance. And the best place to take those is to a transfer station or to like a waste handling facility. So I think there's one kind of down on the the west side of the First Avenue Bridge. I believe there's a facility down there that accepts a wider variety of waste than kind of what goes into your trash can or your apartment building dumpster. So,
all right, so those things that they call flushable wipes,
not so flushable. Unfortunately, no.
Okay. You know what? I want to give you a quick opportunity here if there's anything that you'd like to say to our audience. First of all, Sean, thanks for coming down, joining us, taking this information and doing your best to make it understandable for us. But I want to give you an opportunity here to say final words to our listening audience.
I'd just say that we very much appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with y'all, and would love to do it again. And if folks have more questions that I didn't quite answer, or that they feel like they want some more information, we'd be happy to answer them. If you Google West Point and ecology, there should be some websites that pop up, and they've got my contact information in there, which is just my first name and my last name at ecology, ecy.wa.gov. So, but anyway, I'd welcome folks to reach out and continue asking questions and continue learning more so that we can be better.
This makes me feel like we need to have another discussion about our drinking water, just so that folks know how we maintain that fresh water, which I know this is not your area, but is treated.
Yeah.
And then it's treated again to remove the stuff that treats it.
Exactly. Yeah. Residual chemical stuff. Yeah, exactly.
Easy way to describe that. Well, John, thanks for coming by and sharing this with us. You've been listening to Street Beat with me, Tony B. We've been having a discussion about wastewater discharging and things connected with ultimately our environment, how that works, and how our environment is protected. And the Department of Ecology are the folks that are charged with doing that for us here in the state of Washington and has existed. I did not know this before the EPA. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think so. That's the fact I know. Yeah.
All right. Again, we're going to turn you back over to our regularly scheduled programming now. Thanks for joining us. It's me, Tony B, saying remember, what you believe you can or what you